Hello and welcome to a very special program, the Dueling Narratives of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, featuring Charlotte Korchak. Thank you to our partners on this program, the Rededication Project, May Ever Youth Movement of Moise Safra Center and Prat Leadership Academies in Israel, Jerusalem Education Institute, CUNY Alliance for Inclusion, Alums for Campus Fairness, Students Supporting Israel, VUJU Amsterdam, Herut North America, StandWithUs, and Mothers Against College Antisemitism. And thank you to everyone for being here, those who are joining us today, and those viewing this recording. I'm so grateful to see so many new and familiar faces joining us. And a very special thank you to all of our guest speakers and presenters, especially today's guest, Charlotte Korchak, who I will be introducing to you shortly. I also want to give a shout out to our amazing allies, those who may not identify as Jewish, but definitely have Jewish neshamas, Jewish souls. Those who put so much on the line to fight for the Jewish people, often when we are too scared or too silent or too busy fighting amongst ourselves. Some of you are on this Zoom right now and have been so supportive of these programs and our community, and sometimes they feel alone too, alienated, because of their support for us. So I want to say thank you to them. You guys mean so much to me and our community. My name is Michael Mantell. I'm a psychotherapist, educator, a 3G, the grandchild of Holocaust survivors, and the son of a Sabra, an Israeli. And now I will briefly introduce Charlotte Korchak. Charlotte is the founder and senior educator of the Jerusalem Education Institute, a nonprofit organization working to transform education on Israel and the Middle East. As an accomplished educator and speaker specializing in Israeli history, effective communication, and anti-Semitism, Charlotte captivates audiences with her passionate speaking style and ability to break down the most challenging concepts, making them accessible to a wide range of audiences. Growing up both in the United States and in Israel during the Second Intifada, Charlotte brings a unique perspective as well as firsthand experience of the conflict. Additionally, she earned her BA in Middle Eastern History from the University of Southern California, where she also participated in the Stand With Us Emerson Fellowship. Charlotte began working at Stand With Us in 2010, where she eventually engaged over 50,000 students annually, both online and on 5 different continents, ending her time there as the international senior educator. Often described as a walking encyclopedia, Charlotte's 15 years of expertise leaves audience feeling educated, empowered, and more capable of engaging with their peers on these difficult issues. She has quickly become one of the foremost public speakers in her field. And I'm so grateful that she is joining us to tackle such a challenging and pertinent topic this evening. Throughout the program, we invite you to write your questions or comments in the chat. And at the end of the program, we will open it up for Q&A. No matter how incredible these programs are, and thank God they always are, your respectful participation at the end adds so much more meaning and value. So at that time, please feel free to raise your virtual hand using your hand raised emoji for me to see and call on you, or you can unmute yourself to ask your questions directly if I don't see you. Or you can share your questions or comments by writing it in the chat, and I can read that for you as well. Before we begin, I want to start with a short prayer and then 2 quick announcements. May God bless and protect us and the IDF and our soldiers who guard and protect us, Israel and the Jewish people. And may God have mercy on all people in distress or captivity, and may he bring our brothers and sisters out from their suffering and bring them home. And may we see lasting peace for our brothers, sisters, and allies here in the United States, in Israel, and around the world. And now for 2 quick announcements. They're save the dates. Please join us on Thursday, October 16th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time in person at John Jay College of the City University of New York in New York City for the talk Bringing Peace to the Middle East, featuring Louay Al-Sharif. Louay is a peace activist, content creator, and educator based in Abu Dhabi. Born in Saudi Arabia, his views on Jews and Israel transformed during his studies in France, where he lived with a Jewish host family. This experience inspired him to counter anti-Semitic disinformation and advocate for the Abraham Accords. Since 2012, he has created educational content on language and history, aiming to foster understanding and cooperation between Arabs and Jews. That program is in partnership with the CUNY Alliance for Inclusion, the Rededication Project, and Mothers Against College Antisemitism. On Sunday, October 26th at 10 p.m. Eastern Time via Zoom, please join us for the life and legacy of Yosef Gedalia. This moving tribute to 21-year-old Sergeant First Class Yosef Gedalia, a courageous young man who dedicated his life defending the state of Israel and the Jewish people, and fell in battle fighting Hamas terrorists on October 7th. Through his parents, siblings, and widow, we will remember Yosef's life, bravery, his unwavering faith, and the selfless love he carried for his nation. We hope you can join us for one or both of those programs. With all of that, I want again, thank you all for being here and your continued support of these programs. And again, thank and welcome Charlotte Korchak. Charlotte, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Michael. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. It's great to see so many faces. A few very quickly, one disclaimer. I see faces and age ranges that are very wide, and I have a tendency to speak very, very quickly because I'm usually speaking to high school students. So if at any time I do go too quickly for anyone, please just let me know and I will slow down. You could put it in the chat, just say, can you slow down? And I will slow down. I will do my best to slow down as much as possible. At the same time, though, we do have a lot of information to get through. So try to keep that in mind, and I'm going to try to find the best balance possible. With that, Michael already introduced me, so I don't think I need to introduce myself much further, but it is important, the part of the story that Michael told of me being both an American and an Israeli and living both in the United States and in Israel, which means that what I've encountered is the internal Israeli narrative, the internal Israeli Jewish perspective, as well as spending much time on college campuses in America and around the world, hearing the Palestinian narrative and hearing it from people who aren't necessarily Palestinian. That being said, I've also spent a lot of time in the territories of the West Bank, and I've even spent some time in Gaza. And I've heard stories from the Palestinians themselves. And much of what I'm going to speak about is the Palestinian narrative from their own mouth. Now, all that being said, I think it's incredibly important when we talk about narratives, the narratives are ultimately a story. And while I can tell the Jewish Israeli narrative very well, since it is my story, the Palestinian story is not my story. I don't think it's any of our stories. And I think it's really important to understand that no matter how much I could have studied the Palestinian narrative from an academic perspective, that there is really no way that I could ever do it true justice, given that, again, it's not my story. So while you might be hearing the Palestinian narrative today, I do want you to really seek it out from a Palestinian, either be it from a book or from a video you can watch. And if anyone is interested in those kinds of resources, I'm happy to share them with Michael after this, who could send that out to everyone, so that you can, again, hear it from the horse's mouth. But today will be a glimpse into, again, these dueling narratives that we have that really lay the foundation for the conflict that we are in. So last thing that I'll say is, given that, again, we are talking about narratives, some of the stuff you might hear might be very aggravating. Obviously, the Palestinian narrative doesn't align with the Jewish narrative, and therefore you might hear things that are frustrating. And that's kind of the point. Hearing other people's narratives sometimes pushes us out of our comfort zone, makes us uncomfortable. It helps us grow, but there are growing pains that come along with that growth. So just keep that in mind. And remember that sometimes I am just the messenger here. I'm not the one who is necessarily believing this. But what I will also be doing throughout this is, while I will be presenting narrative, I will also be presenting facts and explaining where both narratives sometimes veer off of the facts and enter again into a space of storytelling rather than the full story and all of the facts that will accompany that true history. So we're going to be dabbling in both narrative as well as those facts, and there will be much to discuss after the fact. But with that, all of my disclaimers are done, and let's dive in to this very difficult topic of dueling narratives. Here we go. There we go. Okay. So with that, let's start with, first of all, the Jewish narrative in a nutshell. When I start to teach, I usually will be teaching young Jews, and I'll always say to them, "What's the Jewish story?" And usually they stare at me blankly, like, "What do you mean, lady? How am I supposed to tell you the Jewish story in with one question? Like, how am I supposed to just answer it? It's long, it's complicated, it's diverse. There are a lot of different Jewish stories." But there's one core Jewish narrative that we tend to cling to that we can actually give over to somebody very briefly. And it includes three core parts. So, what are the three core parts of the Jewish narrative? Well, the first part of the Jewish narrative is going to be the narrative of indigeneity, our indigenous roots in the land. I would argue this is how we start our story, right? Jews come from the land of Israel, whether you start with Abraham, which is our narrative, or you go to King David, which is actually provable history. The Jewish people started in the land of Israel. So that's going to be the first part of the Jewish story always. The next part is, of course, exile and persecution, that the Jews were kicked out of their land and then suffered persecution pretty much everywhere they ended up in history. And then lastly, our story kind of wraps up with the idea of liberation. Liberation through Zionism, liberation by going home, by reestablishing a Jewish commonwealth in the historic homeland of the Jewish people, which essentially will provide Jews protection from that persecution that they had suffered and really tie the knot, seal the circle, if you will, skirat ma'agal, as we say in Hebrew, closing the circle of us starting in the land of Israel and then our story ending back in the land of Israel. Now, that's the Jewish narrative again in a nutshell. The Palestinians are very, very good at keeping things concise. The Palestinian activists or anti Zionist activists are very, very good at keeping things concise and simple, which is also why I just simplified the Jewish story. But their story is concise and simple, and it might look very familiar. Their story begins with their indigenous roots in the land, that they are the rightful owners of that land, that that is the land that they come from, that that is the land that they have been in from time immemorial, is oftentimes a phrase that we would hear early on in this conflict, from time immemorial, going all the way back as far as we can remember. We are indigenous to this land. This is our homeland. The second part of the Palestinian narrative is going to be one of exile and then one of persecution. The idea that they were ethnically cleansed from the land, right? Expelled from that land forcibly by the Zionist colonizers. And then, since that expulsion, those who remain in parts of the land have suffered oppression, have suffered persecution. Ideas like occupation, apartheid, genocide. These are terms that we hear consistently through the Palestinian narrative. And lastly, what ultimately are Palestinians seeking? They're seeking liberation, right? Free Palestine. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Um, so, as we see, we already have an issue, which is that we have a very similar story. In fact, the story is almost identical. And I would actually argue that the Palestinians learned their story from us. It worked, right? Our story worked. We achieved liberation in our land through this narrative, which is a true story. For them, their story is still in the middle. It's stuck in that place of exile and persecution with their cries again for freedom. But we'll talk more about what gets us to freedom, which is really for them that word justice, which again, we'll talk about way at the end in terms of the different terminology that we use when it comes to our narratives. So those are the two narratives in a nutshell. Again, very similar. So let's dive into each one of these categories. First, indigenous roots, right? Let's start with the Jews. The Jewish story, the indigenous roots, we would say Jews are indigenous to the land of Israel, right? That's the most obvious part of our narrative. It's a true claim as part of our narrative. What makes it true? I'm very big on not just giving sound bites, but I'm very big on giving facts. So let's dive in where somebody challenges you on Jewish indigeneity. What can we say to ensure that the facts demonstrate that Jews are indigenous to the land? Well, first of all, Jews became a people in the land of Israel, right? 3,000 years ago, we were united into one people under King David with a common culture, a common language, a common tradition that will stem from that land and continue and persist until today. So Jews became a people in that land. Jews have had a continuous presence in that land for 3,000 plus years. That's another point of indigeneity. The next is very important, that our language and our culture and our traditions come from that land. Also, another point, to be indigenous, this has to be true. And lastly, the Jews come from a pre-settler, pre-colonial society. When you look at this what makes a group indigenous? These are the things. They come from a pre-settler, pre-colonial society. They became a people on that land. They lived there continuously. Their language, culture, and traditions come from that land. And one that isn't up here, which is that they are physically and spiritually, intrinsically connected to the land, which is very, very true about the Jewish people, given that the Jewish people cannot practice all of their traditions unless they. So Jews are indigenous to this land. That is a core part of the Jewish narrative, obviously, as we still, throughout our time in exile, into all of our liturgy and all of our traditions, this idea of not forgetting, but one day of returning. Now let's talk about, the indigenous roots from the Palestinian side. Now, the Palestinian Jews are actually the European colonizers who came and stole this land from us. So let's talk about Palestinian indigeneity. Well, hot take, but maybe not for this crowd. Palestinians aren't indigenous to the land, but this might be a different hot take. Palestinians are native to that land. They are deeply connected to that land. And that is something that within the Jewish space, we tend to sometimes argue about. So again, I'm going to go back to facts. As far as the Palestinians are concerned, they would say, this has been our land. We've called ourselves Palestinians from time immemorial, and we've been here continuously, and we don't know of anything other than Palestine. That's not true. That's true for a small portion of the Palestinian population today. So let's understand. When I say Palestinians are native, not indigenous, why? Well, if you've lived in a place for 100 years, even if you're just born in a place, you're native to that place. And modern day Palestinians are all pretty much born in that place or are descendants of people who were born in that place. But if you go back, of course, many of you are probably thinking, but wait a second. In the 20s, 30s, 40s, there were Arabs immigrating from all over the Middle East to this territory. How can you say that they're native? Well, again, once they have kids there and then they live there for a little while, they become native to that land. Indigenous? No. Now, what's the difference? Well, I told you what it means to be indigenous. Well, if you take those qualifications and you apply them to the Palestinians, we have a big problem. The Palestinians don't come from a pre-settler, pre-colonial society. They were ultimately a people who were colonized, or they were the colonizers themselves when the Arab Muslims entered into the territory in the 7th century and took control over it. So we have to remember, though, is that when the Arab Muslims came in the 7th century, there were people living there. Some of them might have been Jews from 2,000 years prior who just never left. They might have been Jews who had been Hellenized by the Greeks or Romanized by the Romans, or they might have been Romans people who had lived there who were then Christianized by the Byzantines. But then come the Arab Muslims. And most of the population that lives there is Arabized and or Islamicized. And that all foreign language, a language that comes from the Arabian Peninsula. Their culture becomes a blend of Levantine culture, which is kind of the northern Middle East, the area of Lebanon, northern Israel, Syria, a bit of Iraq, what we would call the Levant. And it becomes this blend of Levantine culture and Arab culture. And that's where you see hints of their pre-Arab, pre-colonization history. But much of their culture becomes Arab culture from the Arabian Peninsula, which again strips them of that indigenous status. It's really important to understand that most people in the world aren't indigenous. In fact, 95% of people in the world are not indigenous because most people were at some point colonized. They don't come from pre-settler, pre-colonial societies. They didn't maintain their tribal identities the way that the Jews did, the way that some tribes in random places in Africa or tribes on random islands in the South, in the Far East managed to remain isolated and maintain their identity. That's rare. That's rare in much of the world. And that's why most people aren't indigenous, and that includes the Palestinians. It's important, though, that even though I can acknowledge that at the same time, I also have to acknowledge that while many can't trace their roots back necessarily, they do have a strong and deep connection to this land. They would call it Palestine. They would go back historically and call it Palestine all the way back when the Romans named it Palestine in the 2nd century of the Common Era. And from then on, they would say, this is Palestine and this is my home. They, to this day, even will claim people like Jesus as a Palestinian, really trying to push this narrative of indigeneity. So indigenous, no. native, yes, but most importantly, to understand that Palestinians have a strong connection to this land. Even if they immigrated there 100 years ago from Egypt or from Syria, today they maintain that very strong connection to that land. And that is a huge core part of their narrative, whether the indigenous part is accurate or not. I will throughout this, when I talk about the Palestinian narrative, use a lot of quotes because, again, I think it's important to hear it from the horse's mouth. And this is just one of many. But being one of the survivors, he describes, I know how sincere our relationship is with the land. Its past, its history, its images, its documents. Taken together, they return us to what we need the most, our homeland. This is, again, just one of many quotes that you could find of Palestinians who talk about their connection to their land, their love of their homeland, and their yearning to want to return to their homeland. That's a core part of the Palestinian narrative. Now, the other part, though, is also this idea of Jews being colonizers. In 1937, the Arab leadership in what was then the British Mandate of Palestine established a quasi-government underneath the British called the Arab Higher Committee. They actually established it at the beginning of the 1936 rebellion, which was part of a plan to have a big strike, a big boycott that eventually would get the British to concede to the Arab will. Either way, when the Arab Higher Committee was created, this is one of the many quotes that came from the Arab Higher Committee that says the Arabs of Palestine lived in it prior to the British occupation for hundreds of years and still constitute the overwhelming majority. The Jews, on the other hand, are a minority of intruders. It is impossible to find any justification for the establishment of a so-called Jewish national home. Again, this idea of continuing to push from then all the way until today that the Jews were intruders. Now you'll notice what he doesn't call us at this time. They don't call us settler colonialists. And the reason that they're not calling us settler colonialists in 1937 is because that concept didn't exist in 1937. So instead we were called, again, usurpers, intruders, but again, really the emphasis are these Jews are foreign to the land. And in fact, one of the leaders of the Arab Higher Committee, this man right here, if you could see my mouse, this man is Khaja Min al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. And he was actually one of the biggest promulgators of the idea that the Jews actually have no connection to this land. He very much pushed the idea that the Western Wall, that's not important to Jews. They just named it. It became important to them after the fact because of this story that Muhammad had hooked his horse to this wall, which was then called Al-Buraq, named after his horse. He really pushed the idea that the temple never stood, something that we sometimes hear Mahmoud Abbas also repeating in modern times, that the temple never stood, that this is a fake history. Or what we'll also hear as part of the narrative is that while the Jews might have been there at one point, modern day Jews are not the same people, right? We will definitely hear that as part of the Palestinian narrative, the idea that, again, there were ancient Jews, but the Jews that came from Europe have no connection to those ancient Jews. They're either converts from the Khazar theory, which has been wildly debunked, or again, there's this idea that Jews are just a religion, and therefore there could be Jews anywhere in the world who are part of this religion, but that in no way links them back historically and indigeneity and their indigeneity to the land of Israel. So that's the idea of indigeneity. Two stories, and I should add, part of the Jewish story is also very much that Palestinians are the colonizers, that the Arabs were the one who came in and colonized this land. And that is a true fact of history. It isn't, I would say, true about modern day Palestinians or the people who will go on to call themselves Palestinians in the 20th century. Those people are obviously people who, excuse me, I just lost my train of thought because I'm seeing the chat. I apologize. But hold on. Totally lost my train of thought. I apologize. What was I talking about? Oh, the Jews seeing the Arabs as colonizers. So important. I would not go on campus today and call a Palestinian a colonizer. I would not go to Ramallah today and call a Palestinian a colonizer. I would say that their history comes from colonization, but not that they themselves are modern day colonizers. Let's not do to them what they do to us. It's two wrongs don't make a right. We're not colonizers. They today are not colonizers. But yes, they do have a history of colonization, whereas you could not say the same about the Jews. When the Jews immigrated to this land, we also have a part of our narrative that's somewhat false, that is very much brought up within the Palestinian narrative. The idea that the Jews were moving to there was a people without a land and moving to a land without a people. Well, again, this is a false part of our narrative. There were people there, maybe not very many, but there were people living there who had been living there, some of them for hundreds of years, some of them for millennia. And they very much did feel like we were coming in and we were taking their land from them, that we were these foreigners and they were actually the indigenous native people. So that's the idea, the narrative of indigeneity coming from both sides. Now, the next part is exile and persecution. Now, the Jewish narrative would go that the Jews were expelled from their homeland and faced constant persecution in foreign lands. Now, we all know this history. Let's go through it very quickly. I'm going to spend most of my time on the Palestinian narrative, as I think this audience is pretty familiar with the Jewish narrative and the Israeli narrative. So what do we know? We know that Jews were expelled from this land, right? We know that the Jews suffered both the Babylonian and the Roman exiles. We know the Romans destroyed the second temple, the Babylonians, the first temple, sending the Jews into this exile. This exile that then is going to bring about consistent persecution against the Jews. First, it manifests oftentimes from Christianity. Then eventually it will also work its way into the Middle East with Islam. And then, of course, as we get to more modern times, we're going to also see a secular manifestation of anti-Semitism, predominantly coming from the Germans, from Europe in the 19th and 20th century. The idea that Jews are a race, and this isn't about religion, but this is about the race of the Jewish people, the blood of the Jewish people being dirty blood. And that's also the same time that we're going to have that term anti-Semitism be coined in Europe in the 19th century, describing this hatred of Jews by a German anti-Semite, essentially, who named it that. But we, of course, part of our story is going to be exile and persecution. And that's a very important part of our story because it's going to be the stepping stone to the next part of the story, which is, of course, why liberation? Liberation from what? Liberation from this anti-Semitism, from the persecution that we constantly experienced, needing to, again, being either expelled or being forced to flee from place to place, looking for a safe place to go, eventually realizing that we needed to build that safe place, which of course will be the state of Israel. Now, on the other side, you have the Palestinian narrative, which says that the Palestinians were ethnically cleansed during the Nakba. So this jumps ahead. We were there, this was our home. And then comes this time where the Jews start to come in, the Zionists start to come in, and they start to ethnically cleanse us eventually during the Nakba, and we were given no right of return. So not only did you kick us out, but then you didn't let us return. And then lastly, we've now had to face oppression through occupation, apartheid, and now genocide. This is a lot. So let's unpack this. First of all, the idea of ethnic cleansing. Now, while the concept of ethnic cleansing as a policy of the Israeli state or of the Zionists coming in, that is factually problematic. There is very little to no evidence to support the idea that the Zionists came in with the intention of wiping out the Palestinians. That being said, there was displacement, and we have to acknowledge the displacement. We have to acknowledge that when Jews come in, they didn't steal land, which is the narrative, but they bought land. They purchased this land. But sometimes they purchased land from absentee landowners. And what happened is they would show up to the land that they purchased, and on that land, they would find Arabs living there, Fellahin, the peasant farmers of the land. And they would have to say to them, sorry, but you need to leave. We just purchased this territory. And that would feel like your land is being stolen from you, especially if you're a Palestinian who would say, excuse me, but what does this mean you own this land? Think of land ownership as a new idea coming into the Middle East, especially modern day land ownership. For them, it was, what do you mean? I planted this olive orchard. This is my house. I live here. This makes it my land. And then the Jew comes in and says, well, no, I bought this land. You sold this land to somebody else, and now it's mine, and you have to go. And so the narrative of displacement, the narrative of being thrown out of the land is one that has a small truth to it, that there was displacement. And during the War of Independence, there was also expulsions, right? And here we see an image of one of these moments of expulsion during the War of Independence. But was there a policy to wipe out all the Palestinians? And the answer would be no. How do we know that? There's two pieces of evidence. One, while 715,000 Palestinian Arabs became refugees during the War of Independence. And by the way, that's a narrative thing as well. I just said the Jewish narrative would be the War of Independence, the Palestinian narrative would be the Nakba. And of course, if you were trying to remain neutral, this would be the first Arab-Israeli war. And in that war, while 715,000 Palestinian Arabs became refugees, according to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, the refugee body that looks after Palestinians, 160,000 Arabs remained inside of what became Israel. They became citizens of the state of Israel. They voted in Israel's first election, and they have been part of Israeli society ever since. Today, now, there are 2 million people within the country who have citizenship. And so the idea of ethnic cleansing is a little ridiculous when you hear that and you think, well, how could you claim ethnic cleansing when Israel absorbed Arabs into their country? We didn't have a policy of kicking everyone out. We had a policy of trying to eliminate hostility, violence, and win a war, ultimately a war that would be for our destruction, right? Now, for the Palestinians, it's a very different narrative. For the Jews, the narrative would go, we tried to make peace. We tried in 1937 with the Peel Commission. We tried again in 1947 with the UN Partition Plan. And both times you said no. And then worse, in 1947, you launched a war against us, which is accurate. November 30th, 1947, the Palestinian Arabs start the War of Independence. But for them, they would say, no, this war's been going on this whole time. This has been an ongoing conflict for decades that you started when you came to this land and started to take this land. That's the narrative. So you came, you started to take more land. What did you expect us to do? Of course, we're going to pick up our arms and go to war. So then we go to war. And then it's now during this war, you continue the process that you had from the get-go, which is trying to expel us from this land, trying to take it and make it a solely Jewish state. Now, it's not totally inaccurate that the Jews wanted to make the whole territory a Jewish state. But what was their hope for the Arab population? That they would live side by side with the Jews, that they would benefit from the Jewish state, that they would have equal rights within that Jewish state. But that's not the narrative. For the Palestinians, it was, well, maybe, but we didn't want to live in a Jewish state. We wanted our own country. We wanted an Arab country, not a Jewish country. And so, of course, we're not going to accept any plan that gives the Jews territory. Why would we? It's our land. And I'm going to keep stressing that because you have to try to put yourself in the shoes of a Palestinian and understand that for them, we've lived here. You might have lived here 2,000 years ago, but we've lived here. And all of a sudden you show up and you think that you can just take back this land after 2,000 years of being absent. Maybe a few of you have been here, but most of you have been absent. And we're just supposed to give up 20% of our land, which was 1937, or 55% of our land, which is 1947. No. And here's the bigger narrative that you'll also hear is very oftentimes Palestinians will say, well, why should we have to pay for what the Europeans did to the Jews? They very much see the Jewish state as a, what's the term I'm looking for? As a consolation prize, if you will, as a thing that Europe felt they had to do for the Jews to make up for the Holocaust. And so they say, why should we pay for what you did to the Jews? And worse, they'll say, we treated the Jews great. In fact, we opened up our arms and welcomed them in after the Holocaust, which is a ridiculous notion. The idea that the Jews were not attacked in the land, were not discriminated against in that land, is far from the truth, but that's their belief. And we probably all heard this notion that prior to Zionism, the Jews and the Arabs lived harmoniously in that land. That's also another core part of the narrative. Well, for Arabs, it might have looked harmonious because they weren't necessarily massacring the Jews, but Jews lived as second-class citizens. Jews didn't have equal rights in these areas. And so the idea that we lived harmoniously, yeah, sure, with Jews as second-class citizens, which is, again, not part of their narrative, but that's the part that we would stress as part of our persecution, as part of our own narrative. Now, during the war, during the first Arab-Israeli war, we know that part of that war included displacement. The Jewish narrative would say, it's very simple. The displacement happened because Arab leaders came in and they told the Arabs to leave. And that's what caused people to leave. And so people fled, and that's how we ended up with refugees. Now, that is true. But as Jews, we should know that we left out another part of the story, which is the only part of the Palestinian story, which is expulsions. While yes, Arab leaders were of Arabs to other lands, there were also expulsions. And this is something that we have started to very much acknowledge within our narrative. For the Palestinians, again, it's the only part of their narrative. We were expelled. We were kicked out, period. Nobody fled. There were no Arab leaders telling us to leave. We all were expelled as part of this policy of ethnic cleansing. And here's just one of many testimonies that you would hear from somebody who was expelled during the War of Independence, saying that they were never allowed to return, that they lost everything, their homes, their orange groves, and their land, and that they were never compensated for any of it. Now, there were expulsions. People did end up in places like the West Bank or Gaza, or ended up in places like Lebanon or Syria or Jordan, and they remained perpetual refugees. I will say that their narrative will continue to say that they were never compensated. If anybody who left who owned land wanted to be compensated, they could go and demonstrate their land ownership to the Israeli government, and the Israeli government would pay out compensation. And they actually have paid out compensation to those who asked for it. Many will not ask for it because if you do take money for land from the Israeli government as part of the Palestinian narrative, you become a collaborator with the state of Israel, somebody who sold their land essentially to the state of Israel. And that is obviously seen as a very big negative. Now, the other part, post Nakba, right? We have this reality of expulsion, which is a core part of the story. And of course, I should add that as time went on, the story got much more extreme. It wasn't just expulsions, but it included incidences of rape and torture and murder, etc. Things that have never been proven historically, but are very much part of the narrative. I should stress that if you haven't heard of the village of Deir Yassin, I highly recommend looking it up. What you could do is listen to the Unpacking Israeli History podcast episode on Deir Yassin. Deir is the first word, and then Yassin, Yassin, for those who are taking notes. This is the core, I would say, part of the Palestinian narrative of Nakba. It was a village on the outskirts of Jerusalem. A battle took place there that for the Palestinians wasn't a battle, it was an outright massacre. For the Israelis, it was a battle. It was a battle that took place during the War of Independence. And for many Israeli historians who have gone back and analyzed what happened at Deir Yassin, most would argue that it was a battle that devolved into absolute chaos, where innocent people lost their lives who maybe didn't need to. And the Irgun and the Lehi, the two factions that were fighting that battle, maybe went a little too far in how aggressive they were when fighting this battle. There's much to unpack there, but I'm stressing that if you want to understand the Palestinian narrative of Nakba, you need to learn about Deir Yassin, and you need to hear what they said post Deir Yassin, which was, of course, this idea of, again, rape and torture and murder, which was implanted in the Palestinian narrative and remains there until today, which is why many of you, I'm sure, have heard when we talk about October 7th and we talk about the horrific sexual violence that took place on that day, very oftentimes people will say, well, you started it back in 1948. And they will bring up stories like Deir Yassin, and they will talk about the supposed rape that took place in Deir Yassin, which again, not only has it been debunked, but even the Arabs themselves who said that there was rape came back later and said, we were told to say that, but that didn't actually happen. The Nakba is an ethos for the Palestinians. It is the pillar upon which they sit. And for them, it justifies everything else that is going to come from 1948 until today, including October 7th, which is why when we talk about October 7th, they will say it did not start on October 7th. It started in 1948. And I would always say, if you want to go back that far, then you got to go back even further. And you got to go back to 1920 and 1929 and the massacre of Jews that took place well before any massacre ever took place against Arabs in this land. But that's not part of the narrative. For them, the narrative is one of them being the victim and the Jews, the Zionists, being the oppressor. And we'll see that persist throughout. After this Nakba, another trauma to the Palestinians is the right of return being denied to them. They very much believe, and I'll tell you this story. I went to a refugee camp in Bethlehem. This was about 6-7 years ago now. And I spoke to a young man. His name is Noor Awad. He's probably in his 30s at this point. Back then, I think he was around 25 years old. And he said to me, "We, the Palestinians, we have the right of return. It was enshrined in UN Resolution 194, and it is the world's responsibility to make sure that we are able to exercise that right of return." And he was telling me this story as I was at the entrance to a refugee camp, the Al Aida refugee camp. And I was looking up at what they were so proud of, which was the largest key ever made in history. It's in the Guinness Book of World Records for the largest key that sits over the entrance to the refugee camp on this entrance that they've built. And they said, "One day we'll return." And you realize how deep it goes. You realize here I'm talking to a man who at the time was 25 years old, who was born right around 1995, who's telling me the story of how his family had to flee or really were forcibly expelled from a village on the way to Jerusalem in 1948, and how his family fled south to Bethlehem. They were put in a refugee camp, and that he is now a refugee just like his father was a refugee and just like his grandfather was a refugee. Refugeehood is a core part of the Palestinian identity. And they have great grievances with us. We, the Jews who said we were liberated through Zionism, we were able to go home. Israel was established and we created the law of return. And now a Jew anywhere in the world, as you see in this quote, can go to Israel and become an automatic citizen. But we, the Palestinians, we are not given that right. The Palestinian narrative of refugeehood is also the narrative of victimhood. The idea that we still hold our key to the homes of our grandparents or great-grandparents goes to the idea of perpetual victimhood. And that, again, is a core part of the Palestinian narrative, which, let's go back to Deir Yassin, to the Nakba, to everything that came before. If I am the victim of ethnic cleansing and then genocide and now perpetual oppression, I am allowed to do whatever I need to do to resist. And that could include raping and killing people on October 7th. We've all heard this, I'm sure, in the last 2 years. I want to take a second, though. This is the tragedy of the Palestinian narrative. It's one that instead of feeling anger or frustration towards what you should feel, if I may say so myself, I apologize, is sympathy. Because we don't know as Jews what it's like to be raised as victims. In fact, if you look at our narrative, it's one not a victimhood. As much as I put persecution in our narrative, if you actually ask most Jews what's the Jewish story, they'd probably skip over persecution. And I actually know that because every time I teach and I ask students, what's the next part of our story? They jump from exile to going home and skip over 1,800 years of persecution. And the reason is because the Jewish narrative doesn't allow us to become victims. The Jewish narrative is we're not victims, we're survivors. All right. And what do survivors do? They keep going. They go back and they reflect, by the way, right? They do a cheshbon nefesh, as we're all about to do in the next few days as we go into Yom Kippur. We do a cheshbon nefesh. We do I don't know how to say that in English, but we do a reckoning. We look back on our history and we try to get better and we move forward and we accept accountability when we do things that are wrong. These are all signs of a survivor. For victims, it's exactly the opposite. They don't reflect back. They're stuck where they are. When they reflect back, it's only about how they were victims. And when you're a victim, again, probably the most dangerous part of that ideology is that you can't accept accountability. You believe that you can get away with murder. And imagine 3 generations of that mentality being passed down, father to son, mother to daughter. That's the Palestinians today. And it's tragic more than anything else. It's tragic because it's led to the violence that we've experienced and it's led to, and a justification of that violence. And it's led to, unfortunately, the horrors of October 7th and such a quick willingness to not just support it, but justify it and defend it. So the right of return and the idea of Palestinian victimhood is a core part of their ideology. And that's why when they talk about things, they talk about justice, not about peace. And we'll get to that in just one more second. The last thing that I want to do, I really want to leave a lot of time for questions. We can unpack so much of what I said, but fast forwarding, it becomes ethnic cleansing, no right of return, to then oppression under occupation and apartheid-like policies. And even the idea that Israel is inciting against the Palestinians, which you could argue is more true now than it was in the past. But that's the narrative for them. That from that time, this entire process of Zionism has been to steal our land and to oppress us in our land. And that's what Israel has been doing. And this is a quote from, again, one of the chief negotiators of the Palestinians who passed away during COVID. But he was in those seats trying to be the head of the negotiation team with this mentality behind him. So there's this whole idea, and this gets to really the core ideas that we have that we really differ on. And when we get to liberation, that last piece of the story, it becomes even more clear. Because for the Jews, it was about going home and reestablishing a state so we could be safe. And that's what it was. We liberated ourselves through Zionism with the establishment of Israel, giving Jews the protection that they need. And that's what happened when we founded Israel, right? We reestablish our commonwealth in our historic homeland. We pass the law of return to ensure that Jews can always move back to this territory if they choose to, and it becomes a safe haven for the Jewish people. And our story, again, is complete in a way. For the Palestinians, they would say, we also want freedom. We talked about this in the beginning. Free Palestine from the river to the sea. But for them, if you ask, is it just about freedom? Is it about peace? They would say no. First, it's about justice. Then it's about peace. See, for the Jews, we weren't demanding justice when we got a country. We weren't saying, you owe us for all the ills that the world has done to us, that the British have done to us, that all of you have done to us. You owe us something. No. We just said, we're going to do this. And we hope that you'll support us in our efforts to do this. We're just going to do this. And we'll let go of everything that happened before as long as we can have a country now and we can actually have freedom now. For the Palestinians, that's not the case. We have a few major points of difference in how we view the story. Firstly, the Palestinians view every act taken as resistance, whereas we, the Jews, would see it as terrorism. Targeting of innocent civilians for political or religious means or gains, that's terrorism. They would say every act is resistance against Israeli fill in the blank, Zionist occupation, ethnic cleansing, genocide, oppression, etc. So that's one huge major difference in how we see the history of this story. What they would describe as oppression, checkpoints and the security barrier and infringements on movements and a lack of privacy and soldiers being able to bust into your house at any moment and arrest you and take you out to a tent and interrogate you all night. All of the suffering, the true hardship that Palestinians have had to face ever since Israel's taken control of the West Bank and Gaza, they would describe as oppression. We Israelis, we Jews, we would say all of that are acts of counterterrorism. Those are acts of self-defense against the terrorism. And they would say, well, why would you need to defend yourself against resistance when you're causing the resistance? And people tend to describe this oftentimes as a chicken or egg situation of, well, what came first? Did the violence come first or did the counterterrorism come first? Did the oppression come first and then came the violence or vice versa? And that's another huge contention within our dueling narratives, if you will. And then lastly, it's the language that we use. We Jews, we talk about peace. I just saw a clip this morning of a Palestinian on a radio show. And he said to the guy, stop. He said, the radio host says, okay, we're going to talk about peace, right? We're going to talk about peace because that's what's most important. And the Palestinian guy says, no, that's not what's important. What's important is liberation. And he says, yeah, peace, but like liberation and then peace. He's like, no, liberation, and by any means necessary, liberation. And that is the same idea of justice. It's first justice. Then we can talk about the idea of peace. But no, first I need liberation and justice. And that's why they will chant no justice, no peace. And what's justice for them? It's the right of return. It's Israel acknowledging the ills, acknowledging the ethnic cleansing, acknowledging the attempts of genocide, which Israel, of course, will never acknowledge. And so we have huge challenges. And now add on to that one more layer, the final layer, which is the idea of peace. You know, I hear all the time from Jews, we've offered them everything. How many offers? And I can list them, and I list them, and I give them out to my students: 1937, 1947, 1967, the 1990s with the Oslo Accords, the 2000 offer made by Ehud Barak to Yasser Arafat, and then of course the 2008 offer made by Ehud Olmert to Mahmoud Abbas. And I can list them. And every Jew says to me, we've offered them everything we can. Why should we bother anymore? They've always said no. They clearly aren't interested in peace. And I always have to say, you got to stop and you got to put yourself in the shoes of a Palestinian. Because to us, all of those offers were great. Are you kidding me? The first offer of 20% to the Jews and 75% to the Arabs in the Peel Commission, great offer. 55% to the Jews, 45% to the Arabs in 1947, another great offer. Jump to 2000, and now we're offering them 100% of Gaza and 100% of the West Bank. That sounds great given the current circumstances. Not 100%, 97% of the West Bank. And then in 2008, it was 100% and 100%. And we're thinking, what more can we offer than 100%? But if you're a Palestinian, and your entire narrative has been from the beginning that these people who have no rightful claims to this land came here and stole your entire house and kicked you out. They stole your whole house. And now they're coming to you and they're saying, I have a great offer for you. It's great. I'm going to give you the garage and a big bedroom. Would you think that that's a good offer? That's why understanding the narratives is so important. Because I'm not sitting here trying to say that we need to cave to the narrative and say, oh, okay, so they think that we stole their whole land, so we have to give them their whole land back. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is to understand their rejection, to understand what steps need to be taken to get to a point where maybe they won't reject the next offer. We have to understand their narrative, and we have to start to educate against the falsehoods of that narrative. And that's also a process that the Palestinians are going to have to go through. Now, the Israelis, they've been doing that. The Israelis had the new historians that emerged in the 1980s with Benny Morris and some others who kind of went really far into a little bit revisionist history. That's another story for another time. But all of a sudden, we started to declassify documents from the 1948 war. And these Israeli historians said, we have to analyze this. We have to look at what we did. And they went back and they started to rewrite what exactly happened and where did we go wrong and where did we maybe do things that today we might find immoral or bad. That reckoning is happening already. And so much of our narrative is being corrected in that way. The idea of a land without a people for a people without a land, you don't hear Zionists saying that anymore because now we know we've reckoned with the idea that there was another people there, right? The Palestinians, because of the narrative of victimhood, have never been able to stop and look back and say, where did I go wrong? Some have. There are a few who are scholars who have started to talk to Zionists and others who really do talk about this. People like Ahmed Fouad al-Khatib, who will acknowledge the bad, who will acknowledge the terrorism and violence, who will acknowledge the rejections of the peace plans and why that was problematic. They're few and far between. And so there needs to be a reckoning. And with narrative, we can understand that it's a nice story, but with every nice story, eventually we start to have to see the truth. It's the same thing if you're an American. We were all raised with, George Washington and the cherry tree and, yes, slavery, sort of, but we kind of ignored it. And yeah, the Native Americans and we had Thanksgiving, yay. And then you grow up and you realize there was ethnic cleansing and there was genocide and there were these horrors of slavery that you were never taught. And just like we in America are starting to reckon with that, it's the same idea that every people will eventually reckon with the bad of their past. And the best thing that the Palestinians could do is start to reckon with the bad of their past, because maybe, just maybe, they can start to accept some accountability for how they got to where they are today and not just blame Israel, but maybe look at your own leadership, look at your own choices. And the same with Israel, same with the Jews. We also have to continuously look back and say, where could we have gone? Where could we have done things better? Or how can we learn from what we've done in the past and move forward more effectively? So I'll end there just for the sake of time and Q&A. There's so much more to unpack, but those were just some of the highlights that I wanted to throw out there to help us better understand, again, these dueling narratives and why the idea of stepping forward and trying to solve this conflict. I was about to say make peace, but I stopped because, again, that's my language. But really, it's about how do we solve this conflict and how do we get on the same page, even in terms of our language, to get to a point where we can actually end this conflict and achieve peace and security for both peoples. And that all starts with will. And the will is going to come from learning that history and better understanding how we can get to that better place. So with that, I'll leave it there. And I've seen that the questions have just been blowing up. I don't know if there's questions or comments in the chats, but I'm seeing it pop up every 10 seconds. So Michael, how do we want to do this?
Awesome, thank you. First of all, I just want to say thank you, Charlotte, for your expertise and sharing and having this nuanced narrative perspective, because so many times I wanted to jump in and be like, no, 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 that's just, and then I'm thinking, yes, you're just sharing what a narrative states. So I appreciate that. Thank you for giving us this space. Normally I jump in with my own questions, but I wanted to ask, since I did see a lot of questions, if someone had their virtual hand raised. I don't see it anymore. But I wanted to just see if anyone wanted to ask the first question.
Can I?
Yeah.
Can I please?
Yeah.
I posted in the chat, but I will also
Great.
verbalize it.
And
Yes.
then I see Lauren as well. Lauren, if you can jump in after.
So my question is, it's just a conversation that I had recently, and I was trying to combat it, but I guess I ran out of arguments. Basically, how to support that Israel is not doing war crimes, right? What's happening in Gaza and what Netanyahu is accused of. How do I combat that? How do we prove that what we're doing is a war and it's not really war crimes?
So I have an answer that you're probably not going to like. I'm just going to throw it out there. Look, I think any war expert will tell you this, and every expert I've spoken to in the last 2 years has said this to me. There is no war in history where both sides do not commit some type of war crime. The idea that Israel has not committed any war crimes in Gaza, I think, is a very hard sell. I think it is much easier to argue that the intention of this war is pure, is just. This is a just war that started because of an attack on October 7th. And that while it is a just war, that doesn't mean that every action taken in this war is necessarily just. This is a war being fought by soldiers and individuals who sometimes step over the line and break rules, and they might commit crimes. And that happens in every war. But to say that it is overall a war crime, that this war in general is a war crime, is wildly problematic. This is a legitimate war being fought for a legitimate reason due to an attack that we experienced on our own sovereign territory. And we are trying to eliminate the individuals that committed that attack against us while they are embedded within a civilian population. But the overarching claim of the entire war being a war crime, which gets to the argument of Bibi Netanyahu being a war criminal, you would look at somebody and say, well, why? What makes this war a crime? We didn't start it. We didn't ask for it. It was a direct reaction to an act of war committed, and it would be considered an act of war if Hamas was recognized as a legitimate country in Gaza, but they're not. And so they're not held to the same standards as a country. But what they did was an act of war. And therefore, we responded in defense in Gaza. But I would be very careful to try to say that Israel hasn't committed any war crimes during this war, because the chances of that are slim to none. And more importantly, I would also say we won't really fully know until the war's over, until every incident can be investigated. And even in some incidents that have been investigated, our own army has punished people because they have deemed that the actions that were taken were out of the bounds of what we would call legitimate. And so it's not black or white, but the idea of this war being just and legitimate and legal, that's not a question. And that's really where you should maintain your argument. more
What-
importantly than anything
What I
else.
heard is a counter argument that basically Palestinian, they are sort of winning, right? Like winning the people feel sorry because they turn into victimhood, right? They're using the victimhood to win that war. So what I was told, if Israel did the same, instead of going into active war, like you play the victim card, and then then the world supports you. So how do you argue that?
I mean, with all due respect to that person, I would say two things. One, I'm not interested in playing a victim card. We were victims on October 7th, but we chose to not remain victims. We chose to be survivors who then defend ourselves, knowing that no one else was going to defend us and leaving us no option but to defend ourselves. I would look at that person and say, with all due respect, this isn't a matter of this isn't a game for us. This isn't a game of trying to win popularity or trying to win popular support. We went into a war because we felt that we had to, whether the world was going to hate us or not. For the Israelis, it wasn't about public opinion. It was about making sure that people in Be'eri and in Netiv HaSara and in Nir Oz could go back to their homes and can try to live there without fear that they were going to be burned alive in their homes. And that's what I would look at somebody and say. I would say, you're talking about it as if it's some game. It's not a game. These are human beings. This is a real war. And whether it makes us look bad or not, that's not really the concern. The concern was, how do we make sure that this is never going to happen to us again? That was the number one concern. So we weren't interested in playing a victim card. We were interested in making sure that this was never going to happen again. And unfortunately, that looks really bad because we're fighting against an enemy who has taken incredible measures to try to create the worst kind of scenario in Gaza, where we have a ton of infrastructure damage on top of a casualty count that for Israel is far too high. But it was necessary to eliminate Hamas and to continue to eliminate Hamas. It's tragic, ultimately.
Thank you. This is very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Orit,
You're
for the
welcome.
question, Charlotte, for that nuanced answer. And I think just to reiterate, Charlotte, that point that you made is, I think a lot of people will use these half-truths or lies and say Israel's committing war crimes. And as you said, yes, there may be individuals who are doing it either intentionally or unintentionally, but the war itself is not, right? It's not illegitimate. So I appreciate you saying that. And again, some people use that against us. So I just want to go in order. So Lauren had a question. I know Lori had a question. I see Dimitri, and then Kevin had a question, and Abraham. I'll try to remember that order, but we'll go with Lauren first.
Thank you. And thank you, Charlotte. This was really great. My question is about the Palestinian right of return. And I guess if you could expand on that a little bit, because I've heard different things over the past about why Israel tries to limit that or deters it completely. If you could just expand on that, why Israel is not allowing the right of return, if that's accurate, and why. I guess I just would like things.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And funny enough, whenever I teach the history, I will always try to jump really quickly away from refugees, because if I don't, I end up getting bogged down for like a half hour with Q&A because it is the top issue. So let's try to do it quickly. Some facts. First of all, I mentioned UN Resolution 194, which is something that is quoted to me often by Palestinians. That resolution was the resolution passed in December of 1948 to try to end the War of Independence. And in it, there was a clause about refugees, essentially a clause that, by the way, was also written after the UN delegation had spoken to the Israeli leadership and the Arab leadership. And that clause said that refugees wishing to return and live in peace shall be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date. That's essentially what it says. So refugees wishing to return and live in peace shall be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date. And Palestinians from then on, mainly because of UNRWA, have perceived that as, we have a right of return. It says it. We should be able to return. Caveat though, no, it's not a right, right? It says that you have to be willing to live in peace. There has to be an early practicable date for that to happen, right? Well, after the war, Israel had said, we'll let the refugees return if the Arab countries make peace with us. Well, then once the war is over in 1949, we start to sign these ceasefire agreements in February, March, April, and July. And in none of those agreements did the Arab countries say that they were recognizing Israel and making peace. They all said, this is not a peace agreement. This is a ceasefire deal. We are not recognizing Israel. We do not think Israel exists. So Israel's like, listen, we cannot let 715,000 people back into our country when the entire Arab world is still saying that they want us destroyed. Like, these people could end up becoming a fifth column from within and will try to destroy the country from within. And then, crazy enough, the head of the Arab League at the time, Rahman Azam, actually came out and said that. He said, when the refugees return, they will be saboteurs from within. And you're like, so the Israelis were like, listen, guys, I don't know if you've noticed what just happened to us in the last 10 years, but it hasn't been great. And like, that guy 10 years ago said he was going to wipe us all out and nobody took him seriously. Well, we're going to take this seriously. And we're not about to play fast and loose with the survivability of our state by letting in a bunch of people who could be enemies from within. We can't risk it. That was the initial reason for why Israel said no to letting the refugees initially return. We had no idea who was hostile and who wasn't, right? Huge problem. As time goes on, it becomes a demographic issue, right? Nowadays, it's a demographic issue because what happened in December of 49, after Israel said no to the refugees returning, UNRWA was created. And UNRWA was created to provide welfare to this refugee population. By the way, that was all they were told: provide welfare. A year later, the UN sets up the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees is given two mandates: provide welfare, resettle refugees. Get them off the refugee list. Create less refugees in the world, not more. UNRWA never got the second mandate. So while the UNHCR tries to resettle refugees, UNRWA does the opposite. So what's happened as a result of this is Palestinians are the only refugee population that passes their refugee status on multi-generationally. And that's ultimately led to there now being a register of 5.8 million Palestinian refugees. And so, given the demographics of Israel today, with about 7.5 million Jews and 2 million Arabs, if you added another 5.8 million to the mix, the Jews would no longer be the majority in Israel, and we wouldn't be a Jewish state anymore. So today it's become a major demographic issue. Now, if somebody says, okay, well, but this problem has to be solved, the answer is, well, in 2000 and in 2008, in both of those peace agreements, Israel did offer to provide, and the world and the international community to provide $30 billion to the Palestinians so that they could resettle their refugees in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and in Gaza, in what would have become the Palestinian state. And they, again, because going back to the narrative, the right of return, the Nakba being such a core part of the narrative, really an ethos for the Palestinians, and then add on to that the right of return, the idea of we're not going to continue to push for a right to return inside of Israel, but we'll accept just returning to the West Bank and Gaza is not something the Palestinians have ever been willing to do. So we've attempted to find a solution that wouldn't ultimately eliminate the Jewish state, but up until now, the Palestinians have still said absolutely not. So, and I want to comment on one thing that somebody said in the chat, which is very true. Palestinians are also the only people who, some of them were internally displaced, but they were still called refugees. Let's acknowledge some people said, the person in the chat said something about, living in Nablus, how can you be considered a refugee? So two important things. One is if you were living in Nablus before the war and then you remained in Nablus after the war, you did not get refugee status. I don't know who wrote that comment, but I just want you to know that if you were living in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, or in Gaza prior to the war, you do not get refugee status. If you just stayed where you were living, you don't get status. It's the people who fled from the territory that became Israel into the West Bank or into Gaza that get refugee status. And they end up in refugee camps that are adjacent to those cities. So in Bethlehem, there's 3 refugee camps. And in Shem, in Nablus, there's a refugee camp. And in Ramallah, there's a refugee camp. So all of the cities essentially have these refugee camps attached to them. But those were people who did actually flee into that territory. That being said, if you fled from one part of Palestine, meaning the British Mandate of Palestine, into another part, in no circumstance would you be considered a refugee. You would be considered internally displaced, just like all of our people post October 7th who had to flee from the north or the south to other parts of Israel. We weren't calling them refugees. We were calling them internally displaced persons because that's what they were. Important to remember, though, that there were many Palestinian Arabs who didn't flee into the West Bank or Gaza, but fled to Lebanon, Syria, or Jordan, where they would be, in fact, a refugee according to the definition of refugeehood. So just some clarification of all of that. There's a great book if you want to read more about the right of return. It's called The War of Return, written by Enot Wilf and another author. I always forget that person's name. I apologize to that person. But if this is something you're more interested in, I highly recommend picking up The War of Return and checking that out.
Amazing, thank you. Awesome answer, just very in such great detail. So I really appreciate that. Lori had a question next, and then Dimitri, Kevin, and Abraham.
I can't believe what I just heard. This was the most fantastic analysis of this, of what's going on from all the way back. I'm so overwhelmed by it. I need to keep hearing you say it again and again because there's so much that I'm trying to digest. I almost forgot my initial question, but I have another question too. My initial thing was how to solve the problem. If this is their continual victimhood status, how they see themselves, I don't see how anything could be resolved. It would be, the only way it could be solved or resolved is if the Jews say, okay, you can have it all. We give you all the keys back. Because I don't see any compromise anywhere. I don't think there's enough moderates and there's, to be able to help the people see a different way. Yeah.
Sorry, I wasn't sure if you were done. You're kind of cutting in and out. So I was trying to, can I respond?
Please.
Okay. What you're pointing out is very important, and I saw a lot of people in the comments also saying it. The narrative of victimhood is the most dangerous and damaging when it comes to moving forward in this conflict. No doubt about it. And the fact that the world, by the way, is continuing to promote this. And by the way, I want you to notice something. The Western world is continuing to promote this. There's another part of this world that's not, and is kind of fed up with the Palestinian narrative of victimhood, and that's the Arab world. And I think this is really important to look at because the Arab world, while supportive of the Palestinians to a certain extent, there is an element of it's time to move on. And there is an element of positive forces within the Arab world who have modernized, who are looking to the Palestinians to a certain extent and saying, now's the time to take a different path. Right? Like we've chosen the path of death and destruction, and it didn't do us any good. It's not clearly not doing you any good. Maybe we should choose the path of peace and prosperity. And that's the Saudis, and that's the Emiratis. And these are people who they don't act like victims. They're not victims. And they've built something incredible in the Middle East. And so I do try to look at the positive signs, and I do try to cling to those things and say maybe possibly Arabs in their own language could say to the Palestinians, there is a better path forward. And you have to acknowledge where you've gone wrong. And that kind of education could change the game. But you're not wrong, Lori, that as long as there is that mentality of victimhood, as long as the world continues, and I saw it in the comments also, continues to infantilize the Palestinians, continues to put no onus on them to change the reality, we are going to be in this situation. I will say we are starting to see positive signs in that respect as well. We are so frustrated by the United Nations and what's happened in the last 2 weeks. The reality is at least the bill, at least the legislation, the resolution that was passed to recognize a Palestinian state also included a full dismantling of Hamas, a reformed Palestinian Authority, things that they never included before, that they never talked about before. And again, I know that's it's like small, tiny changes that like some people might roll their eyes and say, really, you're going to applaud that? It's like when the Saudis let women drive and everyone's like, well done. And I'm like, no, well done. Like, keep it up. Positive reinforcement. Every little glimpse of that kind of change is a positive. And that's what we need to be highlighting. And so when they say it, now we can say, you guys passed the resolution, right? It says a reformed PA. Where's the reformed PA? Give us a reformed PA, and then you can create this Palestinian state that you're talking about. And we can all say that because we all know that there's not going to be a reformed PA in the near future. And so there are signs that the world is starting, part of the world is starting to wake up and realize this is not benefiting anybody to perpetuate this. And the Arab world, more than anything, is woken up to this. So positive signs, but you're not wrong. We, in the Western world, the dangers is that we now live in a world where for the younger generation and for the progressive movement, victimhood is a currency. And everyone's competing to be the biggest victim in this world. And it's seen as a positive rather than a negative. That's, I hate to say it, that's DEI's ideology, and it keeps people stuck. But there's also a real push against that now, not just from people who are far to the right, but people in the center who are saying this isn't healthy. And so we are seeing positive signs shifting away from that idea. But it's going to take some time. It's going to take some time. So you're right. You're right. The narrative is the most dangerous, and it's going to be the hardest one to change by far. But once we can acknowledge it and recognize it, then we can work to start to change it.
Awesome. Thank you for the question. Thank you for the answer. Dimitri, thanks for keeping your virtual hand up for so long. You must be tired, by all means.
I actually think Avraham had his hand up first, but Dimitri, but you're managing the show, Michael. So.
Yeah, I think I saw Dimitri and Kevin actually also, and Avraham. Avraham is coming in from Israel, so I almost want to give him the floor, but if he can wait just a little bit longer, I apologize.
I see we have competing narratives about the hands. All right, so Charlotte, thank you very much. That was a really great talk, and I take your general point that we really have to understand, even if we don't agree with, but we have to really understand the other side, right? That's their point of view. So, and I think your last point about, which continued your earlier point about the presence and danger of the permanent victim mentality is both as an impediment to peace, but also just as a very real thing, especially as you pointed out in the West. And I think it's exacerbated in many places, including academia and the media, and it's related to a kind of essentially neo-Marxist division of oppressor oppressed. It's the same idea.
Yeah.
So in addition to that, my question is, in addition to that, another challenge I see, and I want to get your take on it, is on top of that, there's the challenge of an actual kind of a colonial situation, which is, of course, not Israel. One Jewish country in the world, about 56 Muslim countries. So you tell me who's the colonizer. But more specifically, Iran, right? Whereas Iran, for example, is actually funding, let's say, Hamas or the Houthis or Hezbollah, right? So that, I mean, that is, Douglas Murray has made this point many times, and fairly, I think, that that's actually, Iran is colonizing these countries, right? So it's like, and doing this. And so in addition to the kind of permanent victim mentality, and in addition to very real money and arms that Iran was able to kind of throw at so many different places, how do you see that as yet another challenge to peace, which is, I think, what most Israelis and Jews want?
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you look at Iran, actually, I think it's a benefit to our narrative. I would hesitate to call it colonialist, what they're doing, just because exporting terrorism and control, I think is, yes, the control factor, but it has hints of colonization, but really not. And I would avoid, I tend, like, it's the same thing when people say like apartheid in Israel, and then we're like, well, there's apartheid in the Middle East. I'm like, let's just not use the word. Like, we don't have to keep throwing it back at each other. I'd rather eliminate the word entirely because I just don't think it's relevant to this conflict, right? The idea of colonization, it's really not relevant. So that's number one. But when it comes to Iran, I think Iran is helpful to our narrative in the sense that when people look at the story of just the Israelis and the Palestinians, it's like, well, who's the big guy? Who's the little guy, right? And obviously, if you look at the map of just Israel, it's clearly Israel is the force to be reckoned with, and the Palestinians are the underdog, right? But when you zoom out and you include Iran in that narrative, right? And Iran backing the Palestinians along with backing Hezbollah and what was the Assad regime in Syria and all these other rebel groups and the Houthis. Well, now all of a sudden, who's really the oppressor here? Who's really the aggressor here, right? Who's the one that has more power in this conflict? Because again, the people we're also dealing with are constantly looking at power dynamics, right? They're all about who has more power. Well, again, Israelis, Palestinians, it's very clear who has more power. Israelis, Iran, now we're in a different category, right? And so that could be beneficial in zooming out and showing that there is a part of the Palestinian population, about the Palestinian ideology, that is supported by Iran, right? We're talking about Hamas, we're talking about Islamic Jihad. I wouldn't say the whole Palestinian, all of the Palestinian people or all the Palestinian ideology. We should remember that the earlier conflict was really a nationalist conflict more than anything else. And it really evolves more into a religious conflict when we get into the 70s and the 80s and the formation of organizations like Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And they're backed by Iran. But that's an important zooming out for people, I think, when it comes to the narrative of victimhood, to say there's more to this story here than just the, what they would call the innocent poor Palestinians who have just been constant victims of Israel, right? And the Jews being these all-powerful, occupier, colonialist oppressors who haven't had to deal with anything negative, right? Or haven't been the victims of anything else, right? And that kind of changes up the narrative when you throw Iran into the mix, which you should in certain circumstances. But again, I want to stress what you said in the beginning, which is the only way you're going to be able to have these conversations is if you at least acknowledge aspects of the Palestinian narrative that are true. Right? Like, yes, Iran's this big guy, and yes, Iran has done this to Israel, but at the same time, we can't ignore the fact that living under Israeli military rule in the West Bank and Gaza was not pleasant for Palestinians who got caught up in the middle of it, especially for innocent Palestinians who got caught up in the middle of it. And that acknowledgement can show people, like, I'm not sitting here looking at Israel as the best and the Palestinians are evil and Israel can do no wrong and the Palestinians can do no right. No, this is a conflict. And Israel might be just in the counterterrorism measures that they needed to take, but that doesn't mean that that isn't going to be uncomfortable and create hardship and sometimes suffering for the Palestinians. And again, I say that, and acknowledging it is not in any way weakening my case as an Israeli. It's not. It's recognizing that counterterrorism can be seen as oppression from the person who's experiencing it, especially if their narrative is continuing to repeat that idea, right? So like, acknowledge Iran, but also acknowledge the Palestinians, like acknowledge it all. And then all of a sudden we can have a conversation on a much more equal playing field. Right? When we deny it all or say, well, it's necessary because of, again, it can be necessary and it can also be bad at the same time. Right? And we can acknowledge both of those things and say, I fully believe that we have to continue to be militarily present in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank. There's no question. But I can also acknowledge the hardship that it creates at the same time. And Iran is not part of that conversation when I'm talking to a Palestinian, right? It's about their lives. It's about their livelihood that has been affected by Israeli military control. Right? And again, I'm saying all of this, and I know sometimes it's hard to hear, but I've sat in too many Palestinian living rooms and spoken to too many Palestinians about their experiences of having to deal with the Israeli military in Judea and Samaria to understand that this is true for innocent people as well as the terrorists who I could not care less that it affects them negatively. But for the innocent person, I do care. And when I acknowledge that, all of a sudden they can acknowledge my pain of the terrorism itself. And now I can have a very different conversation than what I was having before. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. Kevin, I don't know if you're still on, but you were unmuting yourself at one point. Maybe I was mistaken. I was seeing your face, so maybe you didn't have a question. Am I right? No question. Okay, no worries. Let's go to Avraham. Super patient.
Okay, thank you. Okay, it was a very, very interesting talk. I wrote something in the comment in the chat towards the beginning. The American College Dictionary, which I got as a bar mitzvah present in 1967, defines a narrative as a story of events, experiences, or the like, whether true or fictitious.
Yep. And
which I think was kind of brought out a lot here. And I think that something that has to be emphasized whenever we get into these discussions with people is base things on facts. And if you don't know the facts, And there are a lot of people who, you know, they see what they read on the news media, and I don't want to get political with this. It's not a political statement. I think that it's very clear that the American media covered up Joe Biden's cognitive decline, even when he was running for a second term. And I think that you can, you know, if you say to somebody, don't believe everything that you see on the nightly news or read in the newspaper, and if you want proof that it's not always true, this is it. I saw some reference that CNN actually published a book about the cover-up. And somebody said, well, they want us now to pay for information that they should have given us for free when it was relevant. In other words, you know, to tell people, you know, you have to know the facts. Like, for example, this idea that we got the state of Israel compensation for the Holocaust. The decision to declare the area of the Palestine Mandate as a Jewish national home was made in the 1920s by the League of Nations, the predecessor of the UN.
Right.
So I think that it's very important for us to be armed with the facts, you know, real deep knowledge of the facts going back and back. But as you said, it's very important to acknowledge, you know, how difficult it is. And you just tell people, you know, this might help, especially for Israelis, that, you know, we have a hard time dealing with Israeli bureaucracy sometimes.
Yes.
And I can imagine for you, it's twice as bad.
Yeah. You're hitting on an important point, which is, and that's why I tried to, throughout my presentation, talk about narrative and then infuse facts, right? When is it true? When is it not true? Now, that being said, as a historian, something that I had to learn at a very young age, trying to grow up and become a historian was, well, there are facts. There's also perception of facts.
Mm-hmm.
Which is something else you have to learn, right? And so that's why a great example was the War of Independence, right? That's not a fact. The fact is that there was a war in 1948, right? There was a war between Arabs and between Jews, right? The perception of that for the Jews is that it was a war of independence. And for the Palestinian Arabs, it was the Nakba, right? A catastrophe. And so while the fact is that there was a war, I also have to learn perception, right? I have to learn both. And then I have to acknowledge the perception without acknowledging the perception as truth, but maybe as your perception versus my perception. And that sometimes is half the battle of what we're talking about here, is acknowledging somebody's perception without acknowledging it as truth. And that's really hard. It's a hard balance to find. But when you're talking narrative, that's what you have to be able to do. So I have to be able to look at a Palestinian and say, I understand what it felt like in the late 1800s, late 19th century, early 20th century, when Jews were coming to this land and buying land and then showing up and declaring that land theirs. I very much understand that for you as a Palestinian, you felt like the Jews were stealing your land. I understand that that's how that felt. But at the same time, we have evidence to show that they weren't stealing it, they were purchasing it. And do you see, you can acknowledge the perception and the feeling with then still emphasizing the fact. And if I acknowledge the perception first, the person might be more willing to listen to the fact. But that's the key is yes, facts are important. We have to acknowledge that people perceive facts differently. And that's history. That's why you can read a book on the Civil War from one person's perception, from a Southerner's perception versus a Northerner's perception, and you're going to get two very different narratives on that war. And what's the truth? There was a war, right? And this war was happening. What was the war about? We still don't all agree, right? That's perception, or that's really how you analyze history. So those are very important when you're talking about narrative. And if you want to be able to have this conversation with somebody who is fully bought into the Palestinian narrative, you have to acknowledge the perception without acknowledging it as truth. And that's not an easy thing to do, but I promise you it'll make your conversations 100 times more fruitful and more positive if you can and are willing to do that. It's not easy. It takes swallowing a little bit of your pride. It takes kind of, a little bit of acknowledging that you might not always be right. It's not easy, but it's necessary, in my opinion.
Yeah, thank you. I think the very important point.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
Let's see, Dolev, you have your hand raised as well. I'll give you the floor.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, this was wonderful, and I think that point and kind of the way that you stated it just now, what is, if you could really get both sides to engage in that, and it's such an important exercise, extremely humbling. And I think just humanity overall, not just this conflict, would be better for it overall.
Yeah.
But I guess my question is, when the media, when so many people, when this conflict has been inflated and taken, the front seat against so many other, like, objectively bigger issues, and for us, this is extremely personal. And I'm just like you. I was born in Israel. So I kind of have the Israeli hat, I have the American hat. I've experienced both sides. I haven't had the opportunity to sit in many Palestinian living rooms, but I have had, Palestinian coworkers, Palestinian classmates, Palestinian employees that worked for me. So I've had some conversations, but I think, unless both sides are able to come into it, and like you said, that's a skill that not everybody has. But when the entire world has come to believe that they have skin in this game, the media is part of this war, the New York Times, the ridiculous headlines that they share, and then the little editorial on page 50 that, corrects it. What do you do with that? And it's, again, this has been so helpful, but it's like, okay, I want to come away with a more optimistic view. Like, this is, right now I have this, like, pit in my stomach. So I don't really know what my exact question is, but
I got you.
hopefully you understand what I'm getting at.
I got you. Look, there's a few things that we've got going for us. One is that most people just don't trust the media anymore at all. So funny enough, people who are anti-Zionist think the media is biased towards Israel. And the reason they think the media is biased towards Israel is because if you actually believe that there is apartheid and genocide and all of this stuff happening, well, then of course the media is complicit, because why aren't they reporting those things? So that's why anti-Zionists think that the media is biased towards Israel. And we, of course, knowing the truth, think that the bias is against Israel because they don't report the whole truth on Israel. And then when I talk about the media, I tend to just look at somebody and say, why does the media, like, who are we talking about? And what is driving the media? Is it to inform me? No, we've all learned that a long time ago, that the media stopped informing us a long time ago, right? The reality is the media is worried about a bottom line. They're worried about making money. They're worried about advertisements. That is what they focus on. And the reality is, when it comes to a complex conflict like what's happening with the Israelis and the Palestinians, they just don't have the bandwidth to cover this. They need a simple story, and this isn't a simple story. So they created a simple story. There's a good guy and there's a bad guy. And that fed into the neo-Marxist ideology that Dimitri was talking about, where there's an oppressor and oppressed, right? There's the bourgeoisie and there's the proletariat. And they have fed into that. But again, luckily, most people don't trust the media in general these days. So you can just kind of discard the media and talk about Israel and the Palestinians to individuals one-on-one. My hope lies in the individual, in one-on-one conversations, in the huge and very quiet center that exists right now in the world, that is terrified, that doesn't know who to trust anymore. But when you talk to them one-on-one and you give facts, like Avraham said, and you show them that you're a credible source of information, because not only are you giving them facts that lean towards Israel's side, but you're giving them all of the facts, whether that makes Israel look good or bad in that given moment, all of a sudden you become a credible source for them. And yeah, they might say, but what about this that I read in this media source? Okay, talk about it, unpack it with them, right? Explain how things can be taken out of context, right? Explain how easy that is to do when you're coming at it from a certain angle. And then say, but it's all about looking at the full picture. And then the power that we have is presenting the full picture. And that's why I think this presentation is so important, because when you can start to really truly understand the other person's narrative, then you can present it as well. And when you then become that credible source of information for somebody, they'll come back to you for more information. Oh my God, did you hear about this Trump plan? Like, what do you think about it? Do you think it's a good idea? And then you can unpack things with them. Look, the reality is we have to let go of the idea that we're going to win the media battle or that we're going to win the social media battle. We're not. We still have to fight those battles. We're not winning them. Where we individuals have power every single day is, yes, you can do the route of like writing letters to the editor or challenging a media source to retract something that they said. Guess what? It's a waste of time. They can retract it all they want. They retract it and nobody hears the retraction and we've all moved on. The power that every one of us has is in our own one-on-one conversations with the people that we work with and that we encounter in our lives. Whether that's a peer that's at work, whether that's somebody that you sit next to on an airplane that you have time to talk to, whether that's your Uber driver, whoever it is. The reality is that how I think we're going to make real change is person to person, one-on-one, because you need to become a trusted source of information. And right now we live in a world where nobody trusts anything. And that's a good thing for us, that nobody is necessarily trusting everything that they see online. There is a question mark in most people's minds saying, wait a second, I need to know more. There's got to be more to this story. Because by the way, if there weren't more of those people, there would be a lot more people marching against Israel. And they're not. They're sitting quietly going, I don't understand this, or I don't have skin in the game, or I'm not involved, and so I don't need to know. And then you could come and be a source of information for them. And you could help them understand why they should know and why this is an important conflict that they could disconnect from. But where it becomes important to them is when all of a sudden it leads to anti-Semitism in their own space. And that's where they have to step up and say, look, Israel, Palestine, I don't know, but what I do know is that nothing that anybody does should lead to anti-Semitism. Period. End of discussion. And you can always take it back to that place of anti-Semitism and say to somebody, that's the rallying cry. You don't have to take a side on Israel-Palestine. You have to take a side on hatred. And you wouldn't say to somebody, well, I need to know both sides of racism. Like, I need to hear from the white supremacist, and I also need to hear from the Black person who experienced the racism, just to get both sides of the story. Like, no one ever does that when it comes to hatred. When it comes to Israel, sure, hear both sides of the story. Don't pick a side. That's fine with me. But here's a point where you should get involved, right? And in those one-on-ones, that's how you can pull people in. And then maybe they'll be more interested. And if they're not interested, great. Don't have an opinion. Don't get involved in this conflict. That's totally fine with me. I would much rather most people sitting this one out, right? But it's one-on-one conversations. And you should have hope in those conversations because I have them all the time. I wear my Judaism and my Zionism on my sleeve everywhere I go. I'm wearing a dog tag and I'm wearing a Jewish star and people look at me at airports and they say, I stand with you. Like, I hope the hostages come home. And those are little things that you might miss, but I get a lot more love than hate out there. And it's because I'm willing to be open as a Jew and as a Zionist, and I'm willing to have this conversation wherever and whenever I can. That's how you're going to make real change. That's how every one of us has the power to make real change. One-on-one conversations. And the facts and acknowledging all of what we talked about tonight is going to help you so much in those conversations. Yeah. Maybe we'll take the last two questions and then wrap up just for the sake of everyone's time.
Yes. Thank you. So Orit and then Kevin.
Hi, sorry, one more question. First of all, it's phenomenal. It's so useful and helpful and encouraging. But here's my question about UNRWA. How,
Yes.
considering that their second function was to make sure that they are not refugees anymore, right? That
wasn't.
status.
No, again, UNRWA never had that mandate. The UNHCR has that mandate.
Okay.
UNRWA never was given the mandate to resettle refugees.
Okay, so how come? I understand that the United Nations is very anti-Semitic. We've seen it, we know it. But
well, the General
how come?
Assembly.
Right. How come nobody came back and said, listen, this is ridiculous? How come that's the only organization that continued that population growing and growing? Let's resolve it.
Yeah. Status quo. It became a status quo. And it became such a solid status quo that it became very hard to impossible to change earlier on. And then there's just no will within the UN to change it at this point. And so it just became status quo. It went on for too long. And I will say though, like we are seeing positive changes, right? Like we are seeing Israel said, we're not working with UNRWA anymore. And there's more and more of like an openness to talk about either reforming UNRWA or getting rid of UNRWA and creating a new body. I mean, even most recently in this plan to try to solve the Gaza conflict, UNRWA is not mentioned as an option for anyone who would manage aid or anything else. So we are shifting into a good place of like people realizing how corrupt UNRWA has been over the last 75 years and why we really need a new body to work with. And they've also just come to that conclusion given that Israel in January of this year passed a law saying that they're not working. Well, actually, no, it was 3 months prior. It was November of last year. And then then they had 3 months to make a change of some kind. But they said, by January, we are not going to work with UNRWA anymore at all, which kind of forces the UN to reckon with that and to figure out another option. So at least like we're finally seeing people take note to UNRWA's corruption and what they've done, and we are starting to see a conversation about making change. So that's a positive, but it's going to take time. It's been so established as the body that looks after Palestinian refugees that the idea of resettling refugees now is just it's not even part of the conversation. And that's just, again, because of the status quo after 75 years. So
And another question, like on a different topic. And when you talk to, like, when you're having those one-on-one conversations or when you're on campuses in school, do you talk about Gaza being under Egypt rule until 67 and Judea Samaria under Jordan? Like
you can
to show that they did have the chance to become independent, but like, you know, like under different oppressor, right?
Yeah, so it's important if you're talking about the evolution of Palestinian nationalism. So going back, like there was one of the first comments that I saw was somebody saying that Palestinian history starts in 1964. Well, no, the PLO's history starts in 1964. That's when the PLO was established. The history of the people who call themselves Palestinians goes much further back, obviously, right? They started to refer to themselves as Palestinians in the late 50s into the 60s, but those people existed. They just called themselves Arabs before that, and prior to that, they called themselves by their religion, by their tribe, but they existed, right? And so, when you talk about the evolution of Palestinian nationalism, what people have to understand is that while the identity of Palestinian was forming, so was Palestinian nationalism. And actually, you know, if Palestinian nationalism had been fully formed by 1948, then obviously the first thing that the Palestinians would have done in 49 would have been saying to the Egyptians and the Jordanians, get out of this territory so we can at least declare independence in the West Bank and Gaza, and we can continue to fight against Israel if we want to, again, as they would say, liberate all of historic Palestine. But at least we have a jumping off point. And really what we see in that they didn't do that is that at that point, it wasn't Palestinian nationalism. They were still very much part of Pan-Arabism, which was Arab nationalism. And they saw Egypt and Jordan as just their Arab brethren who controlled part of the territory. So for them, they didn't care that it wasn't under Palestinian rule. They were fine that it was just under Arab rule. Right? And then you get to the 70s and really the 80s when we start to see Palestinian nationalism as we know it today really start to solidify. And then it becomes a Palestine, an independent Palestine from the river to the sea. But then Yasser Arafat goes to the UN and says the West Bank and Gaza to try to get international support, which he does. And it takes another 20 years or so of them saying two-state solution and the world saying, oh, okay, they're legitimate actors. And then we get to the last 10 years when now it's okay again to say from the river to the sea and just destroy Israel. And that's just the cycle of anti-Semitism. We just got further enough away from the Holocaust that it was okay to say that again. But that's the evolution. So it is important to say if Palestinian nationalism had been fully formed by the 1940s, why then did they not demand Egypt and Jordan to leave? That's a fair point to make in that context, yes.
Not only that, but it also why nobody is asking how come their own brothers, right? You know, Arab countries, Egypt, you know, like after October 7, they built an extra few walls. So nobody is asking those questions why they're not helping their own people.
I think people do ask, but I do think there are a lot of good answers to that. That's not just like everyone hates Israel. There are other answers, but yes, I mean, it's worth it to talk about that, it's also understand that it's always going to come back to, yes, but in the end, they're still Palestinians from that territory and they want a state of their own in that territory. So even if their Arab brothers were taking care of them, that doesn't justify them not having their own state and their own right to self-determination. I'm just saying what somebody's going to say back at you.
Yeah,
Like that's going to be the response.
yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Kevin, last but not least.
Yes, thank you very much. Wonderful talk, Charlotte. I learned a lot. I think the most valuable thing that I heard you speak about was this idea of victimhood, this sort of ethos, this internal ideology. I quite enjoyed Mossab Yousef's book, Son of Hamas.
The Green Prince.
In the book, he says, I'd rather die free. I think he said in the book, I'd rather die free than live under an oppressive ideology. And perhaps that's the worst of it, this victimhood. And as a therapist, I see a lot of that. And a huge part of my work is to try and get people to take responsibility for their actions. And it's much more empowering that way. I wanted to ask you, perhaps this is an appropriate last question, religion. I know you're a historian, not a sort of theologian, but for us as Jews, it's more than just geography. It's our heart and our soul. If I forget the O Jerusalem, okay? Yeah. So that's a huge part of us. And that's a huge part of us going back there. And that's why we didn't accept a piece of land in Kenya, for example.
Right. I like that you said Kenya, not Uganda. Good job, Kevin. By the way, everyone who's listening is going, he was wrong. It was Uganda. But just so you know, the territory in Uganda that they offered us was actually in Kenya. It was the Kenyan Highlands. But tell that to the colonialist British. Sorry, Kevin, go ahead.
So I wanted to ask you about the other side's religious motivation. Obviously, Iran funding Hamas, Islam Jihad, their whole ideology is based upon they use the Palestinians as pawns with an intent to destroy Israel in the West and to establish a caliphate and make the world live under Sharia law. So we know that, and we know that Iran and these terrorist groups are using the Palestinians as pawns in that regard, to that end. The ordinary Palestinians living in Judea and Samaria, Gaza, obviously they voted in Hamas 20 years ago, but from your experience, do they have that kind of a motivation, or is it just about geography? And I also learned about you talked about native versus indigenous, right? And I think that's significant, but that's my question. My question is, can you comment on do they have a religious motivation? Jerusalem, Dome of the Rock, this type of a thing.
So yes, but okay, I'm going to try to make this really quick. But if you go back to the early years of the conflict, go back to the late 19th into the 20th century, you didn't hear a lot of Islamic talk. Okay, you didn't hear a lot of, we're doing this for Islam, this is jihad. You didn't hear a lot of that language. It was nationalism. You have to remember that Arab nationalism was sweeping across the Middle East, right? With Hussein, Ibn Ali in the Arabian Peninsula and others. And so really what happened in the 20th century was there was kind of this battle in the Middle East between Islamism and Arab nationalism. And through the early decades of the 20th century, Arab nationalism took control, basically. And so much of the rhetoric became around Arab nationalism, not Islam. Now, during the War of Independence, we have like a couple of hints of things that are Islamic based, which was like a fatwa issued from one of the major universities in the Middle East about this being a fight for Islam, but mostly we don't hear that rhetoric. Hajj Amin al-Husseini had some of it, but again, he was the Grand Mufti, so that would make sense. He was an Islamist, but he was also very much an Arab nationalist more than anything else. And then during the Hebron massacre, we didn't hear a lot of Islamist rhetoric earlier on. A little bit again around the Hebron massacre, a little bit from Hajj Amin, but mostly it was nationalist rhetoric. And that continues with Yasser Arafat into the 1950s and 60s, 50s into the 60s. Where Iran, and remember, Iran at this point also is modernizing and secularizing. Think through the 1920s, Iran has now begun this process of secularization and modernization, which is what eventually prompts the Islamic Revolution to happen in 1979, because they secularize and modernize. But for some in the country, they said, we don't want this. We want the opposite. And that was the Islamic Revolution. And that's when we start to see Islamism take back some of their control from Arab nationalism, which we see then ushering us into the 21st century. And that's when, of course, you see the rise of, for example, the Taliban in Afghanistan and you see the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and you see growing strength of the Muslim Brotherhood in places like Egypt and Kuwait and others. And so really what we see happen is almost a religitization and Islamatization of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, really starting in the 70s into the 80s, where you have the formation of Islamic Jihad only in 1981. You have the creation of Hamas in 1987. Now, think of the other terror groups that Israel had to face before that. The Palestinian Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine,
PLO.
Black September, the PLO, Fatah. These were all nationalist groups. They were not religious. So it's important to watch that evolution as well. Now, you could very much argue that because of the Hamas ideology that has very much swept into Palestinian schools and started already in the early 80s with Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, the founder of Hamas, it has become so much more religious for some Palestinians. By the way, let's also look at Israel. There's also been a Judaization of the conflict that has happened, in the sense that for much of our early history, secular nationalist, and then comes the growing religious Zionists, and now the fringe of the religious Zionists that are more and more religiously extreme and religiously driven, meaning we can't withdraw from this territory, forget for pragmatic reasons. For religious reasons, we can't withdraw, right? This is going to hinder redemption if we withdraw from these territories, right? And you hear that same language now coming from Jews as well. So it didn't start that way. But now I would say the biggest issue in this conflict is religion, because the most extreme on both sides are the religious extremists.
It's been a sort of a gradual evolution from a nationalist conflict to more of a religious conflict, is what you would suggest?
Yes, but the people who are still nationalists are still nationalists. There are some people who are not, their religion plays no role for them. You go to Tel Aviv and you're not going to talk to somebody and say like, oh, it's God gave us this land. They're going to say, dude, we live here. This is our home. And if we give up that land, they're going to kill us, just like they did in Gaza. So like, no. And for them, it has nothing to do with religion. And you'll find a Palestinian who lives in Ramallah who's like, dude, I just want to live my life and I just want to be able to raise my kids. And I don't care about Islam. I just want to be able to live. And you have those people as well. So again, some it's become a fully religious conflict. For some, it's both national and religious. For some, it just remains a nationalist conflict. It just depends on who you're asking.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Charlotte, you're amazing. You've taken us through this difficult terrain all the way out. Thank you so much for being here for this whole time. Everyone, thank you for being a part of this. We really hope to see you again on October 16th and 26th for other programs. Charlotte, you're incredible. I recommend if anybody wants to check Charlotte out, I'll share your website. Potentially everyone should have you speak to their group. So hopefully that will happen as well, have more people educated in the conflict. Charlotte, thank you so much for everything. Everyone, Shana Tova, Gemar Chatima Tova, and hope to see you all at the next event. Take care, everyone.
Definitely. Gemar Chatima Tova, everyone. Shana Tova.